Hey everybody, welcome back to chemistry. So in this presentation, I want to talk about what a catalyst is. So if I can increase the slide. So here I have a slide that sort of summarizes what a catalyst is. And so a catalyst is some kind of matter that can speed up a reaction so it can go faster. It can be an element, and one possibility of an element that acts often as a catalyst is the metal nickel. Another possibility is the metal palladium, and another possibility is the metal platinum. But then catalysts don't necessarily have to be atoms from an element. It can be a molecule, a large molecule, which is comprised of a lot of different elements. And these large molecules, which are proteins that can catalyze chemical reactions, are called enzymes. And we'll talk more about those in a bit. So the way the catalyst works is by lowering the activation energy of the reaction, by lowering the potential energy of the transition state. So importantly, the catalyst is not consumed. It does not become something else in the reaction. It does not change its form, so it can be used over and over and over again in the reaction. So here I have a diagram that describes how a catalyst speeds up a chemical reaction. So I'm hoping you'll look at this diagram carefully later, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of redraw this on the glass board as I give an example of a catalyst. So if I can decrease the slide. Metals can act in catalysts for a lot of different chemical reactions, but I want to focus in on a particular chemical reaction called a hydrogenation reaction. And so this is a chemical reaction that is used a lot in the food industry. So let me give you a simplest example of a hydrogenation reaction. So a hydrogenation reaction is where one of the reactants is hydrogen gas and you react it with other reactants. And there's a choice of other reactants that you can use to react the hydrogen with. But in every case, all the reactants have a double bond in them. And so I want to write out the simplest example of the hydrogenation reaction that reacts with a molecule with a single double bond. So this is the reaction here. What it is you take a molecule called ethylene. Its formula is C2H4, and this can be found in the gaseous state, but I'm just going to leave out the state symbol to make my life easier. And then again, this molecule is called ethylene, and then you can mix it with another gas. This would be hydrogen gas. Hydrogen gas is in the form of a diatomic molecule, so it's two hydrogen atoms stuck together, so its formula is this. And so you can put these molecules together, and under certain conditions, they will react with one another. And basically what happens is the two hydrogen atoms in this molecule go on and add on to ethylene to make a new molecule. The new molecule will have two carbons like you had before, but it has two more hydrogens, so it's now H6. This molecule is called ethane. So again, this is an example of a hydrogenation reaction. So again, hydrogenation is basically where you add diatomic hydrogen to a double bond. So to show you that ethylene here has a double bond, let me go ahead and draw its Lewis structure. So it looks like this. And so we have a carbon double bonded to another carbon like that. And then we have from each of these carbons two hydrogen atoms like this. So that's good old ethylene. And now what it'll do is it'll react with diatomic hydrogen. So I'm hoping you can draw a Lewis structure for that. So it's just H single bonded to H. And then those are the reactants, and the products will be ethane. So ethane is basically ethylene, but it has a single bond between these carbons instead of a double bond, and it has two hydrogens attached. So it looks like this. So here's the single bond between the two carbons. And then what I'm going to do is I've drawn in a total of 4 hydrogens. So we put in 2 more hydrogens. Looks like that. Okay, so that looks like a good description of this hydrogenation reaction. Now, when you had hydrogen to double bonds to form the single bond, you add the 2 hydrogen atoms in. This tends to be an exothermic reaction. So to indicate that this is an exothermic reaction, I'm going to write plus energy like that. So this is a nice exothermic reaction. Also, we can add this energy term up here if we want to. Okay, so at this point, what I want to do is I want to draw a energy diagram for this reaction. And so to do that, I'm going to need two axes like this. And so on the y-axis, I have enthalpy, and I'm hoping you remember enthalpy is the potential energy of these molecules, and then we have a reaction coordinate. So we talked about what that was before, is just following the energy of this reaction as it progresses from reactants to products. And so on the left side of the graph here, what we're going to do is maybe sort of arbitrarily mark out where the enthalpy of these reactants is. And so we'll say it's here. Just arbitrarily say it's here. So this is ethylene, which is C2H4, and this is H2. Okay, so now let's map out where the ethane product is in terms of this diagram. And you should be able to tell me whether you think the energy of this ethane product is higher than the ethylene and hydrogen reactants, or is it lower? Well, if this is an exothermic reaction, hopefully you'll remember that the reason why it's exothermic is because the products must have less energy than the reactants. And so the reactants have to get rid of some of this extra energy, release it as heat, so that they can go to the lower energy of the products. So here, we'll put here the energy here. We don't know exactly how far down it is, but we know it's lower than the reactants. So this is C2H6. Okay. So if we wanted to, we can sort of mark out why this is an exothermic reaction. So I'm going to draw a line across the graph like this, and from the product, and see this difference here is the change of enthalpy. And so the change of enthalpy, as you recall, is the products minus reactants, and so the products have less enthalpy than the reactants, and so this is going to be negative. So that again indicates that this is an exothermic reaction. Okay, so now I want to tell you a fact about this hydrogenation reaction. If you mix these gases together, you can wait and wait and wait, and you're not going to get much of a reaction at all. And so this is a very slow reaction, and very, very, very slow. So it will occur if you wait enough time, but it might take years before you get any kind of reaction to occur. It's a very slow reaction. And so onto this energy graph of this reaction, let's somehow indicate that this is a slow reaction. How do we do that? Well, to indicate that, we need to indicate that this reaction apparently has a very high energy transition state. And so you're going to need a lot of energy somehow getting to these reactants to get it to go. So normally at room temperature and pressure, this just won't go. And so we indicate this by showing the energy by going up to the transition state, and this is going to be a very high hump here, and then going down to the product. So this is the transition state. And so the activation energy for this reaction is huge. So I'm indicating here with EA. Okay, so this is a nice energy diagram for this reaction. And so what the food industry wants to do is it wants to make this reaction go faster. And so I want to explain to you why that's the case. So if I can increase the slide just for a second. So what the food industry likes to do is it likes to harvest oils from vegetables or plants, which are in a polyunsaturated form, and then it wants to convert them into a saturated form. So let me talk a little bit about this. So you can harvest from safflower oil, and this may be a molecule you'll find in safflower oil. Maybe one of the things you will notice if you look carefully is that this molecule has double bonds in it. So oils are nice, but saturated fats are even better. And so the food industry, what it will want to do is somehow take the same molecule and then add hydrogen to it, and then you can see in these same positions here, we no longer have a double bond. Instead, we have a single bond. And so here, if you can convert polyunsaturated fats to saturated fats, what you have done is you have removed the double bonds and you have replaced them by single bonds. And so the reason why saturated fats are so important to the food industry is because they're in everything you eat. And so, for example, they are in margarine and they're in butter, and they're also in a lot of snack foods because saturated fats tend not to oxidize or rot as quickly as polyunsaturated fats do. So the food industry is really interested in this particular reaction of taking polyunsaturated fats with double bonds and converting them to saturated fats with single bonds. And so they can do it, but if you just stick things like safflower oil, which have polyunsaturated fats, into hydrogen gas, it'll still take forever for this reaction to go. So about 120 years ago, someone found out how to make this hydrogenation reaction go much faster. And what that person found is if you take molecules with double bonds, like ethylene we have here. Now, just a note, another word for ethylene is ethene, so just keep that in mind. So we have ethylene here. You can mix it with hydrogen gas, but if in the mixture you include metal shavings from metals like palladium, platinum, or nickel, then you can create the product that you want, which is a saturated fat with no double bonds, just single bonds. But this reaction occurs a lot faster. And so here we're just showing that in this example, you're mixing ethylene, which is ethene, with hydrogen, but here you're mixing it in the presence of a catalyst, which is palladium. And so C here just indicates that this is a catalyst. Now, you don't necessarily have to use the element palladium. You can use nickel, that's a good catalyst a lot of times, and you can use platinum. So the question is, why do these metals make this chemical reaction go faster? And so what I'm about to describe to you is that these metal catalysts, what they'll do is they lower the energy of the transition state. And so they lower the activation energy. And so it makes the reaction go faster for that reason. So if I can reduce the slide. So in my example here, I described this reaction. And here in the example I was using, here we did not add any kind of metal shavings to the reaction. And so we would say that this is the uncatalyzed reaction. So the uncatalyzed reaction has a very high energy transition state, and so there's a large activation energy needed to get the reactants over that hump into products. And so if you do add metal shavings from nickel, palladium, or platinum, what that will do is you'll take the same reaction and merely lower the energy of the transition state. So now I'm going to draw a curve for the catalyzed reaction. So the interesting thing about this, when you add the catalyst, it does not change the energy of the reactants. So the energy of the ethylene and the hydrogen are exactly the same. All it does is it stabilizes the transition state so that it's lower energy. So this hump here, this energy hump, is now much lower. But, and again, this catalyst will have no effect on the energy of the products. So very importantly, this reaction between here uncatalyzed in blue and catalyzed in red, the reactants have the same energy, the products have the same energy, but the transition state energy for the catalyzed reaction is much, much lower. And so if that is the case, the activation energy is not nearly as high, and it could be that therefore you can get this reaction to go at, say, normal conditions that are attainable in a lab, like maybe a little bit of increased pressure, and that will be enough, and maybe a little bit more temperature, and that will get this reaction, this catalyzed reaction, to go. Okay, so I wanted to explain to you what the mechanism by which the metals cause this reaction to go faster. We know that in some fashion it's going to lower the energy of the transition state and therefore lower the activation energy, but what is the actual steps that this metal catalyst does its job? So if I increase the slide. So here is a nice model of how we think a metal catalyst will speed up a hydrogenation reaction. And so what you have in metal shavings is that you have this nice surface for your reactant molecules to bind to. So here in this case, the catalyst is nickel, and so this is the surface of it. So again, imagine that the shavings just have millions and millions of these nickel surfaces. And so the first step to get this reaction to go faster is what you do is you take this hydrogen molecule here, which is H2, and then what you do is sticks onto the catalyst surface, and then the bond between the hydrogen atoms breaks, and so you have the hydrogen atoms just kind of sitting there on the nickel surface. And so the next step is that the ethylene molecule flies in onto the surface, and then the ethylene molecule has a double bond here, as you can see, but then the ethylene molecule lands on the surface. And when it does, the double bond between the carbon atoms will break. And so the next step is that here now these hydrogen atoms that were stuck on the surface, they will crawl on and bind to these carbon atoms. They'll form bonds with the carbon atoms. And then the final step is that now that the extra hydrogens have bound to the carbons, a single bond will form between the two carbon atoms, and once that is complete, then this molecule flies off. So very importantly, you can see something really kind of important here. When we're at A, what you can see is that some molecules are binding to the surface and bonds are breaking. When we're at B, we have other molecules binding and bonds breaking. C, you have new bonds forming, and D here, the molecule, your product, is released. But I want you to know something important. As you go from A to D, as you cycle through this reaction, one thing I'm hoping you can see is that the green nickel surface does not change at all. So the green nickel surface that you see at A is retained in D. It hasn't changed at all. And so that is a major point about what a catalyst is. A catalyst will allow a reaction to occur on its surface, but in the process is not changed at all. And so this catalyst, this nickel surface, can be reused for another hydrogenation reaction. And so this is one of the powerful things about a catalyst, in that you might have to spend a lot of money maybe to purchase a catalyst for a chemical reaction, but because it can be used over and over and over again, it will last you a very long time, and so it may be worth the price. There are a couple other things that we want to mention. One thing we want to kind of note here is, why is it this reaction goes faster with the catalyst? And there's sort of a couple reasons for that. So one reason is this. Imagine that you have these reactant molecules, which are diatomic hydrogen and ethylene, trying to react in three-dimensional space. And so they will try to collide with each other in space, and you just have to hope that those molecules will have the correct orientation and enough energy such that they can achieve the transition state and become products. Now, what you can do is instead, if you offer a catalyst to these molecules, it serves as a surface for these molecules to dock onto. And so once the molecules are on the surface, then you have taken a three-dimensional search, and once again they're on the surface, it becomes a two-dimensional search. And so the molecules can more readily find each other and react with one another. This, in effect, increases the concentration of the reactants, and so the reaction will go faster here is because of increased concentration. So another reason why this reaction will go faster is because in some fashion the catalyst lowers the activation energy of the reaction. The only way it can do that is if somehow it changes the way in which the molecules interact with each other to form the transition state to become products. So what is likely going on here is that when the catalyst offers a surface to the diatomic hydrogen molecule and the ethylene molecule, and these molecules bind to it, what is probably happening is once those molecules are bound to the surface, it doesn't take as much energy to break those bonds and release the atoms compared to if you didn't have that surface there. If that occurs, then what will happen is that you're going to lower the activation energy, for this chemical reaction. And when you do that, then the reaction will go faster. So there's a lot of commercial interest in trying to figure out how to make a naturally slow reaction go faster without having to increase the concentration of reactants or increase the temperature. So we have found that nature has created something called enzymes. And so what enzymes are, they are proteins found in your cells that can make chemical reactions go much faster. And so without enzymes in your cell, you would be dead. And the reason why you would be dead is because chemical reactions that are needed for your cells to generate energy so that you can survive tend to, by themselves, go very, very slowly. They go too slowly to keep you alive. And so we need enzymes in our cells to make these chemical reactions go faster. So let's go over one example of an enzyme. This enzyme is called lactase. So lactase is an enzyme that will break down the milk sugar called lactose. And so here is lactose, I just circled it. So where do you find lactase? Well, you can find lactase within cells, but the context I want to describe lactase, though, is how it helps you digest food in your small intestine. So imagine we're looking at a cross section of the small intestine. So that is the outer tube of the small intestine. And so you have an inner tube, so I'm going to make the surface of the inner tube of the small intestine bumpy. And so here we have food traveling down the inner tube of the small intestine, so I've marked that as F. And so what happens is that the cells lining the inner tube of the small intestine create the enzyme lactase, and it goes into the inner tube, and it breaks down lactose molecules, which you sort of see a picture here. And so the way it breaks down lactose molecules is actually not unlike how we saw metals reacting molecules together. And so I want to explain that. So here we have a picture of the surface of the lactase enzyme. And so we're only looking at a part of the surface of it. So you can imagine here that maybe the lactase enzyme is rather large and it goes on maybe in certain directions. And so all this area here is filled with atoms. And in fact, enzyme, which are proteins, can have tens of thousands of atoms here. And so what we're looking at in green is only a portion of the surface of the enzyme. So remember how the surface of the nickel metal was important for binding the reactants of the hydrogenation reaction together to get them to go faster? Same thing here. The surface of the lactase enzyme is very important to allow binding of the lactose molecule. And so the lactose molecule binds to the surface of the enzyme like that. And then the goal of the lactase enzyme is to break this bond here. It does it by adding water. And once that bond is broken, then you release the enzyme here. The enzyme, as you can see, is unchanged in this reaction. It's the same as it was before, but it has released these pieces here, which can be readily absorbed by your cells and used as fuel. So, in final note, you probably are aware that there's some people out there that are lactose intolerant. And the reason why they are lactose intolerant is because they may either have low levels or are completely missing this enzyme that's just talked about, which is called lactase. And so if you're missing this enzyme, the problem is if you have food traveling down your small intestine, you don't have any lactase enzyme there to break down any lactose in the milk products you may have consumed. And so if that's the case, the lactose is still in your food. However, as you might imagine, in the inner tube of the small intestine, it is not an aseptic environment. There is bacteria in the tube of your small intestine, and that lactose, which you won't be able to break down, will go to those bacteria, and the bacteria will consume it and produce a lot of gas. And so that gas can cause problems. It can give you gas, and it can give you diarrhea. So thank you for listening to that. We'll see you next time.